Hi, I'm Murphy-Kangas, and today I'm going to be talking about the long-term vegetation dynamics of grasslands on Santa Cruz Island. And we'll start with a little background on the island. For thousands of years, Santa Cruz Island was home to the Chumash people who lived off the abundance of the ocean's natural resources. But starting in the late 1700s, the island Chumash were hit hard by diseases brought by the Spanish, and their population declined. And in 1822, the last of the island Chumash moved to the mainland. In 1850, the island was bought by a wealthy San Francisco businessman who shipped cows, sheep, and horses out to the island and set up a ranch. And for the next 130 years, Santa Cruz Island was pretty much one big livestock operation. This caused large-scale ecological changes, most notably the proliferation of non-native annual grasses, which dominate the island today. And starting in 1980, the island came under the joint ownership of the Nature Conservancy and the National Park Service. Pigs were introduced to the island sometime in the mid-19th century. They rapidly increased in numbers and spread across the island. Although there weren't as many pigs as sheep or cattle on the island, their ecological impacts were high. They like to dig underground and eat the roots and bulbs of plants, a behavior known as rooting, which can be much more destructive than the grazing of cows and sheep. The effects can be seen in this picture, where there's a clear dividing line between the areas exposed to pigs and those pigs were excluded from. The removal of livestock was considered the first major step in restoring Santa Cruz Island ecosystems. The sheep and cattle were sold off soon after the island was protected, but the pigs remained until 2006. As the island transitioned from being an active livestock operation to a protected area, the new land managers at the Nature Conservancy started exploring different possibilities for restoring the island's ecosystems. One option that was tried was prescribed burns on the island's grasslands. The hope was that fire would reduce the thick cover of invasive grasses, allowing native forbs and grasses to become more abundant. Forb, by the way, is just another word for a plant that is not a grass and not a woody tree or shrub, so it's a broad category. My advisor, Dr. Klinger, was the resident ecologist for the Nature Conservancy on the island throughout the 90s, and he oversaw these burns and the subsequent study. There were 3 separate burns and 3 subsequent years, and all 50 plots were sampled for 3 to 5 years post-burn to quantify the short-term vegetation dynamics. Results showed that the prescribed burns did little to reduce the dominance of non-native grasses, which you can see in this figure. The relative cover of non-native grasses stays around 70% after the burns. And the picture on this slide is actually of one of these burns while it was happening. My project made use of the same plots as the 90s burn study, which are shown on this satellite image of the island. However, we were only able to sample 40 of the 50 due to time and accessibility constraints. We went out at the end of April to do the survey and used the same methodology as the original study. At each plot, we did 4 different data collection techniques, but the one that I focused on for my analyses was the quadrat data. At each plot, we surveyed 5 1x1 meter quadrats, recording all species present and their percent cover within that quadrat. And on the bottom left, there's a picture of Mari and Rachel doing just that. The data I analyzed for this project involved comparing the 90s quadrat data to the quadrat data collected in 2023. I used pair t-test to compare the average relative cover of different groups of species, like native and non-native, within quadrats between the 90s and 2023. This involved averaging the results from the different years of sampling of each quadrat in the 90s, and then comparing those averages to the 2023 data. And here's a few pictures from our fieldwork trip. Santa Cruz Island is a pretty beautiful and awesome place to do research. And there's lots of little island foxes walking around. So for this project, I wanted to get a general idea of how the composition of the island's grasslands have changed over time. And to do this, I asked 3 separate but similar questions. Has the relative cover of native and non-native species of the grassland plots changed from the 90s compared to 2023? How do the responses of native and non-native species differ between grasses, forbs, and shrubs? And has the proportion of geophytic plants increased since the 90s? So first, looking at native and non-natives, there are a couple of plots showing that. And you'll see on the y-axis is relative cover. And what does that mean? So a quadrat might have 25% cover of native species and 25% cover of non-natives, with the other 50% as bare ground. In this case, the relative cover of each would be 50%. I use this metric instead of the raw cover data because it controls for differences in the amount of bare ground between quadrats. The graph on the left splits the data up into individual years, while the one on the right lumps all the 90s data together. As you can see, the non-natives in blue were far more abundant across all years than the natives. In 2023, the relative cover of native species was 26.2%. This did represent an increase of about 8% from the 90s average and was statistically significant. So although there was no dramatic increase of native cover from the 90s, there is evidence that native species are doing better than they once were. I use the same exact methods to create the graph shown in this slide, except they're split into 5 categories: native and non-native forbs, native and non-native grasses, and shrubs. Virtually all shrubs on the island are native species. This analysis yielded some interesting results. For starters, the relative cover of non-native grasses decreased by about 14% from the 90s to 2023. However, they were still by far the most abundant group. For forbs, both native and non-native forbs increased in abundance. Of the groups, native forbs showed the most dramatic change from the 90s, from around 3% to around 12% in 2023. Shrubs and native grasses showed little to no change from their 90s average. And the last group of plants we looked at was geophytes. And geophytes are perennial plants which have an underground storage organ, like onions and potatoes. They also include some of the island's most beautiful flowers, like blue-eyed grass and Mariposa lilies, shown there. And they were staples in the diet of the island's feral pigs. And we hypothesized that their abundance would increase in 2023 compared to the 90s, since these areas were no longer being affected by pigs. In the 90s, geophytes had a relative cover of only about 0.5%. However, this went up to about 1.5% in 2023. So it's not like they're dominant plants now, but this was a statistically significant increase, and it suggests that these plants are benefiting from the removal of pigs. Before I summarize the conclusions of this study, I should mention some of its limitations. In my analysis, I just did a straightforward comparison of 90s versus 2023. The only variable I really considered was time. I did not account for some of the factors we've already discussed, like the fire intensity and the severity of pig rooting at each plot, as well as year-to-year differences in precipitation. But with that being said, we found that non-natives still accounted for more than 70% of relative cover in 2023. However, native species showed a modest increase of about 8% from the 90s to 2023. Among the different groups of species, native forbs showed the most obvious difference from the 90s, increasing to more than 4 times their 90s average in 2023. Non-native forbs increased as well, while the relative cover of non-native grasses was lower at any point than it was at any point in the 90s. And shrubs and native grasses didn't change significantly. And our other group of plants, geophytes, increased from about 0.5% relative cover up to 1.5 during that same time period. So overall, my results indicate that the grasslands of Santa Cruz Island are still dominated by non-native species, but that native forbs have made a significant comeback relative to their levels in the 90s, which should be considered a conservation success. I would like to thank the William and Linda Frost Fund for the Frost Research Fellowship and Undergraduate Student Research Award, and everyone that was a part of our field crew this spring and who's all shown in that picture, as well as the Nature Conservancy for providing lodging, transportation, and access to the reserve, and my advisors. Thank you all.